He knew that during this time before a fit he used to be extraordinarily absent-minded and often even confused objects and persons, unless he looked at them with especially strained attention. But there was also a special reason why he wanted very much to make sure that he had been standing in front of the shop. Among the things displayed in the shop window there had been one that he had looked at and that he had even evaluated at 60 kopecks. He remembered that despite all his absent-mindedness and anxiety, consequently, if that shop existed and that thing was actually displayed among the goods for sale, it meant he had in fact stopped for that thing. Which meant that the thing had held such strong interest for him that it had attracted his attention even at the very time when he had left the railway station and had been so painfully confused. He walked along, looking to the right almost in anguish, his heart pounding with uneasy impatience. But here was the shop. He had found it at last. He had been 500 paces away from it when he decided to go back. And here was that object worth 60 kopecks. Of course, 60 kopecks, it's not worth more. He repeated now and laughed. But he laughed hysterically, he felt very oppressed. He clearly recalled now that precisely here, standing in front of this window, he had suddenly turned, as he had earlier, when he had caught Rogojin's eyes fixed on him. Having made sure that he was not mistaken, which, incidentally, he had been quite sure of even before checking, he abandoned the shop and quickly walked away from it. All this he absolutely had to think over quickly. It was now clear that he had not imagined anything at the station either, and that something absolutely real had happened to him, which was absolutely connected with all his earlier uneasiness. But some invincible inner loathing again got the upper hand. He did not want to think anything over, he did not think anything over, he fell to thinking about something quite different. He fell to thinking, among other things, about his epileptic condition, that there was a stage in it just before the fit itself, if the fit occurred while he was awake, when suddenly, amidst the sadness, the darkness of soul, the pressure, his brain would momentarily catch fire, as it were, and all his life's forces would be strained at once in an extraordinary impulse. The sense of life, of self-awareness, increased nearly tenfold in these moments, which flashed by like lightning. His mind, his heart were lit up with an extraordinary light, all his agitation, all his doubts, all his worries were as if placated at once, resolved in a sort of sublime tranquility, filled with serene, harmonious joy, and hope, filled with reason and ultimate cause. But these moments, these glimpses were still only a presentiment of that ultimate second, never more than a second, from which the fit itself began. That second was, of course, unbearable. Reflecting on that moment afterwards, in a healthy state, he had often said to himself that all those flashes and glimpses of a higher self-sense and self-awareness, and therefore of the highest being, were nothing but an illness, a violation of the normal state, and if so, then this was not the highest being at all but, on the contrary, should be counted as the very lowest. And yet he finally arrived at an extremely paradoxical conclusion: so what if it is an illness? He finally decided. Who cares that it's an abnormal strain, if the result itself, if the moment of the sensation, remembered and examined in a healthy state, turns out to be the highest degree of harmony, beauty, gives a hitherto unheard of and unknown feeling of fullness, measure, reconciliation, and an ecstatic, prayerful merging with the highest synthesis of life? These vague expressions seemed quite comprehensible to him, though still too weak. That it was indeed beauty and prayer, that it was indeed the highest synthesis of life, he could not doubt, nor could he admit of any doubts. Was he dreaming some sort of abnormal and non-existent visions at that moment, as from hashish, opium, or wine, which humiliate the reason and distort the soul? He could reason about it sensibly once his morbid state was over. Those moments were precisely only an extraordinary intensification of self-awareness, if there was a need to express this condition in a single word, self-awareness, and at the same time a self-sense immediate in the highest degree. If in that second, that is, in the very last conscious moment before the fit, he had happened to succeed in saying clearly and consciously to himself, "Yes, for this moment one could give one's whole life," then surely this moment in itself was worth a whole life. 22 However, He did not insist on the dialectical part of his reasoning. Dullness, darkness of soul, idiocy stood before him as the clear consequence of these highest moments. Naturally, he was not about to argue in earnest. His reasoning, that is, his evaluation of this moment, undoubtedly contained an error, but all the same he was somewhat perplexed by the actuality of the sensation. What, in fact, was he to do with this actuality? Because it had happened, he had succeeded in saying to himself in that very second, that this second, in its boundless happiness, which he fully experienced, might perhaps be worth his whole life. At that moment, as he had once said to Rogozhin in Moscow, when they got together there, at that moment I was somehow able to understand the extraordinary phrase that time shall be no more. 23 Probably, he had added, smiling, it's the same second in which the jug of water overturned by the epileptic Muhammad did not have time to spill, while he had time during the same second to survey all the dwellings of Allah. 24 Yes. In Moscow he and Rogozhin had often gotten together and talked not only about that. Rogozhin just said I was like a brother to him then, he said it today for the first time, the prince thought to himself. He thought about that, sitting on a bench under a tree in the summer garden. It was around 7 o'clock. The garden was deserted, something dark veiled the setting sun for a moment. It was sultry, it was like the distant foreboding of a thunderstorm. There was a sort of lure in his contemplative state right then. His memories and reason clung to every external object, and he liked that. He kept wanting to forget something present, essential, but with the first glance around him he at once recognized his dark thought again, the thought he had wanted so much to be rid of. He remembered talking earlier with a waiter in the hotel restaurant, over dinner, about an extremely strange recent murder, which had caused much noise and talk. But as soon as he remembered it, something peculiar suddenly happened to him again. An extraordinary, irrepressible desire, almost a temptation, suddenly gripped his whole will. He got up from the bench and walked out of the garden straight to the Petersburg side. Earlier, on the Neva embankment, He had asked some passerby to point out to him the Petersburg side across the river. It had been pointed out to him, but he had not gone there then. And in any case there was no point in going today, he knew that. He had long known the address, he could easily find the house of Lebedev's relation, but he knew almost certainly that he would not find her at home. She must have gone to Pavlovsk, otherwise Kolya would have left something at the scales, as we arranged. And so, if he set off now, it was not, of course, in order to see her. A different, dark, tormenting curiosity tempted him. A new, sudden idea had come into his head. But for him it was all too sufficient that he had set off and knew where he was going. A moment later he was walking along again, almost without noticing the way. It at once became terribly disgusting and almost impossible for him to think further about his sudden idea. With tormentingly strained attention, he peered into everything his eyes lighted upon. He looked at the sky, at the Neva. He addressed a little child he met. It may have been that his epileptic state was intensifying more and more. The thunderstorm, it seemed, was actually approaching, though slowly. Distant thunder had already begun. It was becoming very sultry. For some reason, just as one sometimes recalls an importunate musical tune, tiresome to the point of silliness, he now kept recalling Lebedev's nephew, whom he had seen earlier. The strange thing was that he kept coming to his mind as the murderer Lebedev had mentioned when introducing the nephew to him.